I'm excited to welcome you to the Writer Center's virtual craft chat series, where we talk with writers a little less about what they wrote and a little more about how they wrote it. My name is Emily Holland, and I'm thrilled to have Olatunde Osinaike here to discuss his collection, Tender-Headed, with us this evening. Olatunde, thank you so much for joining us. We're so excited to have you.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it, and I'm very fortunate to be here.
Great. So to kick us off, could you read a couple of poems from the collection for us?
Yeah, would love to. I'm going to read first from a poem I don't often read aloud, but every poem is meant to be read aloud. As we'll talk about sonics later. So yeah, I'll start off with this one. It's entitled Poem Ending in Two Truths and a Lie. The boy was born and raised in a downward trend. On paper, it should have been as easy as giving candy to a baby. But in reality, it was more like a blind date. We're talking exit strategies, sub-zero winters, and a wealth gap where he had had the good with the bad, the nursery rhymes and the crash course, the pilot and the discontinued, how to keep up appearances and expensive taste, 1994. It was then the boy learned the price had gone up and will despite his grievances. It was then the boy recognized his quick feet, his steady bidding. The shortest pencil is better than the longest memory, the idea of dying for something you believe in, not unlike the idea of making a name for yourself. Celebrity, celerity, sincerity, charity, clarity, or other. So the boy signed the leg of a friend cocooned in plaster. So the boy made bracelets that broke like friendship when contact contracts its destruction. So the boy was granted sneak peeks into what it is that is expendable, 1994. It was the year he learned people still lived in black and white. In the years since, the boy clung and clung to the former glowed in the dark, no easy feat, to grind, grin, gripe, grip, and grit, to spin, split, spit, sit, and sift, to shun, shunt, hunt, hint, and hinder, to lie, 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 live, lie. It is tainted. It is impeccable. You sing America the Beautiful. He sang America the Red Flag. You think American. He asks, am I America? America at its best, adjective, at its worst, adverb. The boy, yet a part of speech as tense as time. Can I go on with the second one?
Yes, yeah, please do.
Okay, cool.
Love letting, we're just gonna sit with that one. So good.
So the second one, I made it a point to read at every event for this tour, in part because it shapes in a lot of ways the conversation throughout the book, but also because it's an opportunity for me to recalibrate upon the intersection on which this book plays, which is my Blackness, the underside of that, underbelly, but also the privilege that comes with being a man in a patriarchal society, and that privilege. So, yeah. Men like me. Boys will be boys. Manly, slick, elbow grease, baritones, singing low, unruly, higher than a hierarchy inherit, plausible deniability, disorder, bachelors and awful apostles, dark nights. Concades like a character arc, compensation. Deafen a suffrage, sulk. Storm sellers, the fragrance of kingdoms, ladybug and don't believe much in luck. Believe in overstaying a welcome. We'll name anything after us, detention centers and muscle cars. Squad. Thumb through classifieds, flashing lights, shock value. Slide hands in the slow close of an elevator door, door stopper, stop things, won't. We'll rep the rhetorical like it's the home team, shoot the shot to blame the angle, blame things, see floral print and scurry, see flowers like flowers hold both water and scent, sent some heaven sent a good morning text this week, gossip, but call that barbershop talk. Double meaning, deprecating, duffel bag crazy, colonialize, call that authority, monopolize until it's good guys, tough guys, all of the above. Treat all we touch like tungsten, can't temper anything. Love a melting point, get physical. Have a problem with the word no, yes men. Have more than just a problem with the word no. Antsy with violence. Prefer a seat or stall between us and another, stick up for and subjugated to nothing, jog memories for fun, jog freely at night and day. Interrogate, bastard, blue, everything. Culture, coercion. Hate to admit it with tailored suits, soot and tie, check her. Call it chess. Don't call it control. Call it like a time of death. A flat tire said with our chest, repeat what's been said before, but in a tone society loves. Hate being adjacent to the action. Hate. Keep that. Invest. Keep that. In hotbeds and chit chat, men of the house, our own men might not start it, but will end it. Love when we aren't followed or replaced. Love having the last word, so we take it wherever we go, front lines. Confessional booths, prenups, shotgun weddings, law and order reruns, boardrooms, proms, distilleries, salary negotiations, horror films, Oval Offices, on air.
Thank you. Thank you for choosing those two. I think a lot of our questions in our discussion will sort of be exemplified in those two poems that you chose to read. So super excited to chat, and thank you for reading those. Before we really get into the heavy hitting questions, could you tell us a little bit about who you are, maybe how you came to poetry?
Yeah, interesting. I think my journey's a bit atypical. I wasn't much of a reader growing up, actually. Not like, really in the books in that way. I was always more driven toward math, the traditional, like you're in the math and sciences, you think you're gonna go doctor or engineer, which I end up doing. I'm like, did development. I do software development. And somewhere along the way, I ran into a Lucille Clifton poem. And I think what most interested me about poetry was the ability to work through something. I appreciated that challenge. But shortly after, I think it became more of the question of voice and what it is you're dedicating your space or time to. So, like after that Lucille Clifton encounter, I was starting to dig more into poetry, and that was right when I was starting college, and then that was when I jumped into spoken word, which is probably my first introduction to form, if you will, and word inhabiting the body in the ways that it can. I am the oldest of three Black boys from the west side of Chicago, so I do not take it lightly, the life that I have inside of this body. And also that particular experience that I have had in my life. And poetry makes space for that. So, yeah.
No, that's beautiful. I love thinking of this, your encounter with the Lucille Clifton poem. Perhaps all of us can remember that encounter that we had that really opened up the world of poetry or the possibility of poetry in a way that was unexpected. And we saw ourselves in some way there. It's really beautiful. All right, so we're going to start with maybe our most difficult question. Some people love it, some people find it really tricky. But poets were always sort of taking such care and noticing so much about the work we read and the work that we write. And so I'm wondering, what is something that you notice within your work or something you intentionally do within your work that hasn't been brought up to you yet in terms of maybe talking about the collection or talking about your work overall, or something that you've been wanting to talk about but haven't had that opportunity to?
Yeah. So often in conversations, it's about the book having its own legs, and which I'm blessed about, or blessed and thrilled to know, to have experienced. But then it also kind of turns into a conversation about those experiences and how they're shared with those that have encountered the book, which makes for a great conversation. I don't get to often talk about where the book has led me, as to, or as also a recipient of it. And I think particularly I'm thinking about how it's widened my vocabulary. It's a bit, it could be a bit challenging or rugged to read through a lot of these poems because I don't separate myself from the speaker of the poems. And so when I say that, I mean I'm not using, and that's great that folks do, but I'm not using maybe mythology to kind of use as a third person, or using that as a demonstration of what is happening in my own life. Rather, a lot of poems are based in experiences that I have had to understand. But yeah, it's widened my vocabulary. Even when it first came out, I was sitting with trying to learn ASL, and that was particularly driven by the idea of widening my grasp of community. There's a quote by Greg Pardlow. It's don't be afraid to use your many Englishes, which I think is kind of humorous, because a lot of times you're maybe taught to limit yourself to one particular way of expressing where you're from or what you think or how you feel. But then the backside of that is also that every conversation is two-way. So the ability for that conversation to be a conversation is that it's received at all. So I'm thinking about those communities that may not be able to receive this book. Communities that I definitely had in mind when I wrote it, but I've had trans folk come up to me and talk about their own experiences with a patriarchal world, white, cis mask, women, men. It's just the worlds kind of intersect, and I'm really interested in that intersection at large. So yeah, I think that's the thing that I haven't really been able to express, because the book has challenged me too.
That's beautiful. Yeah, it's not often we get to think about, it's not just readers who get to encounter our words, but it's also us that are sort of changed in that process too, and that process of becoming as an artist, right? That sort of lifelong process that is ongoing. I think you put it so beautifully. Thank you. So you mentioned a little bit about sort of spoken word being the first kind of form of poetry that you engaged with. And I had some questions about form, but I wondered if we could start with this idea of spoken word, which I think maybe gets to a question that was put in the chat earlier. about, poems on the page and then poems being read aloud or sort of voiced. And I wondered if you could talk about those sort of differences that you see, maybe a poem living on the page and then a poem as you read it or speak it, and how you go about sort of embodying the poem in your readings, which I think we could hear in your breaths and your pauses and the emphasis that you gave to the poems you read too.
Yeah. I I am a proponent of a enjambment, but I also understand this is enjambment for the page for those that may not know the term. It's caesura, which is like the line break. Um, and so coming from the spoken word community, it was very much like trained, like there's a cadence to everything. In particular, there's an immediacy that I guess is more readily available with spoken word than that is with the written page. And so for me, form was always interesting to consider for the page, because I didn't think that there was a time where I doubted it could even encapsulate fully what I was trying to express. And I remember there was this there's this quote by Jack Gilbert, I believe, that has to do with so again, I'm coming from the software development world, like parsing through code is like the way I get through things. But even in that, there's a certain type of version control. So when I think of like the page, I'm thinking about its container as a perceived limit. And I'm not always respecting that limit, even on the page. So there are times when, there's forms in here that I think of like Eve Ewing, Electric Arches. I'm not sure if anyone has that on their bookshelf, but it's an amazing poetry collection, and particularly the series that are the retelling series, where she'll write for the page. Is usually in block form. And then midway through, she'll cut it out as kind of like where that volta is occurring, or really like the cliffhanger, whatever you want to call it. And it's beautifully done where she starts to write out a different, like a kind of like a flip on what is expected to happen. And so I think of created forms and received forms in the same way, where there are prose poem blocks in the book. But with spoken word poetry, usually perform it the same way each time. Like that's the guide. That's the way you should go about it. Whereas the page, there's an expectation of what it should inhabit, and I enjoy pushing against that. So there's like a Jack Gilbert poem. I think it's like the name is escaping me, but the poem has to do with like a cherry tree. And so I was using that for a long time when I started writing, because I wanted to excuse myself from the work of like having to figure out what form we could do for a poem. And so often the energy in a poem can come from the form. I think about even there's an interview I read with Marilyn Nelson, and she was talking about how like the Petrarchan sonnet is like its ancestor really is like the idea or the desire to want to create a perfect poem. So that's where that form came from. And what even is a perfect poem. And so thinking about like form as this way to generate energy when or push you toward this involuntary action, though you may not want to. So moving yourself outside of a comfort zone, if like you're struggling even to generate content or think about an idea, I think a form is helpful both in spoken word and the written form, because it can encourage you to do something that you may not want to do, or at least may not come naturally to you at first. So I'm not sure if I really answered the question, but I kind of like I bounce around. So
No, that's great. I mean, there's so much we could talk about with form, and there's some really wonderful forms. I mean, you mentioned prose, which comes up a couple times, the prose poems. Even Men Like Me, right, with that sort of opening, that pause, that caesura that we felt when you were reading, right? That's really beautiful. But I was also so drawn to the more inventive forms. I mean, escalator talk being one that really stood out, right? Where visually on the page, we get that sort of stepping, and it's encouraging us to read in a different way and kind of see these new possibilities. So, how do you kind of conceptualize the way that you approach form when you're writing? Does the form come first? Do you start the draft and then sort of work your way towards a form? I'm always curious on at what point do you decide that a poem needs something a little different?
Um, I'm always interested in exploring something new. So there was a period of time when I was writing this book over the course of several years where I was interested in like sestinas and villanelles, and there were some times when it fit and sometimes when it didn't. Um, Insofar as the energy of the poem didn't necessarily match the form. Um, Escalator Talk in particular, and some of those other ones, I'm particularly drawn to, as I mentioned at the onset, what it might look like to have this poem live outside of your body and not so much on the page. And so I would encourage anyone that isn't maybe in spoken word or didn't grow up in the Def Poetry Jam era, like definitely like tap in and like like view some of those performances, because it's interesting to see. There are times when you'll have um rappers at present day like come on and perform unheard of lyrics to songs that were literally coming out maybe within a year's time. And it was almost like their their test branch, their test environment to spell out what could happen for a poem. But yeah, I think like for example, even like escalator, so make room, for example, is almost an ode to my former self that was so enthralled by spoken word. I found it odd that I never saw poems that emphasized breath,
Mm.
probably. And if they did, they were usually shorter poems. I think I might have seen a question in the chat about like what Lucille Clifton poem. I couldn't recite it for you right now, but I know there's a sanku, which is like kind of like a haiku that was in the book. The book is Mercy. It's called Mercy. Um, and very short, inhabits the body. But because it's so very short, the word doesn't linger with you. And I was interested in a form that could highlight our capacity to stay with a poem and to spend then more than just like a few minutes with it. What that might look like if you choose to, one reader might take 3 minutes to say the next line. One reader might take, 5 seconds, whatever that might be. But escalator talk, even I think I'm thinking back to the measure of involuntary movement. Like we often think about the story of Lazarus in terms of the gaze from like Mary and maybe Jesus even, but maybe not so much Lazarus. And I found that kind of interesting, particularly in a space at the time and now where violence against bodies is so we're just desensitized to it. And so I'm thinking about involuntarily, like what it might mean for Lazarus to have had his body raised up without question or like consideration or conversation at time of, that the distance between when he died and when he was raised versus like, Jesus when he died and he was raised. It's victory in two different periods. So yeah, I was like, okay, well, why not an escalator? We're on that every day. And we're moving without necessarily being the ones that move. So yeah, just small things that could be playful and humor is hard in a poem. Humor is hard to write for and on beside of. And so even something as small as that um, can act as levity for even the topic, or levity for the person I was when I was writing it. So.
Yeah, I love that, sort of the idea of making space, and not just visual space, but also sort of space for the reader to kind of navigate their engagement with the poem too, and space for you, the writer, to navigate that distance between the writing and then the current self as well. Um, yeah, I love that. Wow, I'm thinking through so many things. There's so many different ways that we can take this. So you mentioned rappers trying out lyrics and spoken word. So I wondered if this was a good time to talk about the sort of music impact on the book. We get the kind of three sections of the book that are all pulled from sort of music, voice terms, right? There's epigraphs from musicians. There's a lot of sonic play within the poems. I think the two that you read really showcased some of that texture that we get, the beats, the sort of alliteration, even that rhyme inside. So can you just, or to start, maybe talk about the role of music in your own life and in your writing process?
Um, I would say music is the clearest primary way for me to see. And see in this particular sense is make meaning of, render thought from an image. A lot of times I grew up in I grew up in like a family that we all sang. Me and all my brothers sang, so we were all in choir at some point. My youngest brother, went to choir school at a certain portion of his life. And so, yeah, like, I don't know, it's my way to decipher. And so often the sonics of a poem move before my instinct in a poem. And so trying to like counteract or balance that is a fleeting but necessary endeavor, which I appreciate. Yeah, I mean, so you mentioned the camp of poems that I affectionately call the liar poems, Lyre. I was Latin and Greek kid in high school. So I was like particularly interested in like etymologies and things like that. Um, and even like the idea of like technology, like that's the base word is like technique, which is like means craft, which could be a lot more, it could be a lot more musical than what it's made to seem, or made to be, or what it's leveraged as in terms of industry, in present time. So yeah, I mean, music, I write poems, listening to music. I don't know that this whole book, I wrote listening to music, and it may have been, Philadelphia soul music. It may have been, I don't know, lo-fi hip hop beats. But at some point, even I guess like I have this small series I do for myself mostly. It's called like Sample Stuck on Repeat. I do on Instagram. And so like the Cento form, I'm interested in like what it means to imitate and or replicate, while creating a new world from. And so I mentioned Eve Ewing's book, which I think does this, but I think there's also a number of other books that are particularly intelligent about their usage of after poems, or ascribing a pop culture reference in the title or the lyric. And actually, I'll add those at the end of this, just so folks have that for their whatever. But yeah, I would say music is, it's the truest thread, for me to establish where I am and be honest to that. I think there's with this book, because it is so personal to me, I wanted to be accountable to those poems. And so, and even the thoughts that I had, like, 11-year-old Olatunde thought a certain thing because of a song, or even the artist behind the song. And, that's honest. Like, there's nothing bad with that. But at the same time, interrogating that and why that is, and on behalf of that kid. So, what so often leads me to the poems that I love is my ear. And in the same way, the departures from the things that I once considered probably sacred to a degree would also have to go through that, those trenches. So.
Yeah, no, I love that. I loved sort of spending time with the poems a little bit more and sort of doing some of that reading aloud, right? Where you can feel the texture of the words, you can feel the rhythm in the punctuation. And then, of course, when you get to the end notes, you get some of those details like, oh, this was pulled from this song lyric, or, oh, this was referencing this. And I think it's nice to have, the poem adds its own meaning to whatever that sort of inception point was, but then we get that extra layer at the end as well. So we're sort of working with the creation of meaning within those two. Okay, let me take a look in the chat. I know we have some questions here. Della's wondering if you've ever gone back to a poem and rewrote or maybe revised based on where you are in life now versus where you were when you first wrote the poem. It's a great revision question.
Yes, to answer that question. And not only that, I'll flip my answer in two parts. There are certain poems I revisit, particularly because they're not driven by maybe public interest. So almost like the spirit of a diary, writing for you truly. We're in like the publishing world. So like, okay, these poems are meant to be out there. But there's most of these poems were also edited at some point. And particularly with an eye to, there's a journal, Underbelly, that's run by Maya Marshall and Marty McConnell. And
I love it. I love that.
Yeah. It's a great, it's for those that are not, that don't know it, it's the vision for the journal is to walk readers through earlier drafts of a poem. So, whereas you might, you have it. Thank you.
Look it up real quick.
Most times you see in journals or in books, like you're always looking at the finished product. But whereas in this journal, you might see 2 or 3 earlier versions of poems that artists bring. They talk about, those notes they've written in the margins and like how they work through that, the things that the poems were telling them. And that's particularly insightful because I would love, this is probably a dream, but I would love like seeing an image of my poem with strike-throughs in it. Because they are not so much that they're negating what I wrote, but rather they're working through their own memories. There are certain, again, those lyre poems, like when I say abracadabra, all the sadder, like some folks have different memories when it comes to the Outkast song, right? And I love like being able to talk about those memories and maybe what was going on in their life at the time, and like, what turning through those things as well as things that are in here. No poem is meant to present, for me, no poem really should ever present as a finished quote unquote product, because it's it's really just snapshots. It's just really meant to represent what it was then. And so I think it's a particularly interesting question because there are some poems that I do the editing maybe in my like alone. But there are some poems I almost dream of editing in the community. So yeah.
No, I think that's great. I think, it's so difficult, one, to even think about revision in a concrete way, I think is sometimes the hardest part of the process. And that's why I love Underbelly. I always show it to my students when we're talking through revision, because you can see those moves, and you can sort of even see the time that it takes, right? The life you have to live outside of the poem to go back to it. And I think it's so poignant what you said, right? A poem is never final. Like, even if it's published, like it's here, who knows, you might be reading out of this book one day and make little line edits as you're reading. And I've seen poets do that out of their published books. And yeah, it's sort of amazing that extended life of the poem too. And I think, since we're talking a little bit about revision, I wanted to circle back to Miriam's question about the title of the collection, Tenderheaded, and maybe loop it into a question just about how you formulated kind of putting these poems together, how you came up with that kind of three-part structure with that opening poem that sort of introduces or sets the stage for the poems. How did you decide which poems belonged in this collection, which ones maybe could fall away? Where did the title fit in that process as well? Might be a good way to connect the two.
Yeah. For starters, so tenderheaded, for those that aren't aware, is a term in the Black community for those that are known to kind of like shift in the chair when they're getting their hair done. And so, yeah, for me, like I did that as a kid. I actually kind of still do it. Like you're having a blade put to you in the, I guess, barbershop context. You're having a blade put to you, different parts of your head. You might be sensitive, and it's almost the acknowledgement of the sensitivity. Because at sometimes you're taught to, by way of either like the hand to steering the skull or being the rock upon which the head sits, to not move. Other times it's just natural. There's nothing wrong, particularly with being tenderheaded. It's just a connotation. So that's, I would say, that came after. There's a number of poems in here I'm thinking about. I see your comment, Janet. Number of poems in here that are thinking about, and I think even the second poem in here, On Deep Conditioning, is thinking about a boy thinking through ideas passed along to him. You mentioned Frank Ocean earlier. There's a line from Siegfried, which is quoted in the book, which is dealing with an idea from another man's mind. And so often we inherit these ideologies and they're not necessarily called to question about like where they came from, their sensibilities. So this book, when I was looking through and just writing poems, I had noticed that a number of them had to do with that topic of what it might mean to question or interrogate the things that, particularly from, from like thinking about the masculine spirit or what that might mean, masculinity, in this conversations that we don't often have in our community. Is something that presented in a lot of different poems in a lot of different ways. And so that's where that comes from. But then also, of course, like I'm Latin Greek kid growing up doing solos, and particularly I was singing classical music and Gregorian chant with my brother. So we're thinking about those elements, and that's where the titles come from, the subtitle, I guess the sections of the book. I guess a little known fact I've only shared a couple times, but I had initially set out to write something that was a bit more cinematic. My middle brother, which I have mentioned, but he very intelligent dude, and he studies cinema studies. And so we often talk about like screenplays and writing for a screen and what that might mean to adaptations and, just cinematography, different Easter eggs on screen, like all that stuff. And as I was working through that, in the faintest sense, I was thinking about memory a lot. And, tenor is the initial section, which has to do with like, it's thought to be like, you hold or continue, like it's a low part. And I admittedly like lowered my voice when I was growing up because I did sing soprano, and it was like, okay, like, but you're a Black guy from the West Side of Chicago, so maybe like not the most like appealing thing, perhaps, you know what I mean? Like it wasn't like seen as like cool. And so if you want to be cool, like maybe deepen your voice, maybe like lower your register. So I did that, even though like now it's like I kind of miss like being able to hit a falsetto, like when I, like I miss that feeling, at least in the ways that I could before. So yeah, like tenor, thinking through what ideas that I kind of hold steadfast to. Tremolo, the next section, is thinking about the things that I kind of waver on. And forte, the things that I might consider to be stronger because of. So yeah, like that's kind of where those three sections come from. And like, again, like music and even in the barbershop context, like music is always playing. You walk in, you might see, at least my memory is like you're seeing Jet magazines and like you hear the stereo blasting like oldies on the radio and everyone's talking and chatting. And it's a lively environment, but it's, as I mentioned, like Men Like Me, like, we have our own gossip. We have our own channels of disappearing information. So, just thinking through a lot of those elements.
Yeah, I love the layers to the language, right? It sort of goes back to what you mentioned earlier, right? The many Englishes, right? The sort of layers of meaning depending on where you are in space and time, who your community is, and your cultural references too. Great. Let me just take a good peek in the chat. Reminder to folks, please pop your questions in there. We have some time for some more. I wanted to circle back to this idea of community that I think was brought up a little bit earlier. And we've been talking about these musicians that sort of come into the poems in different ways. You've referenced a lot of poets today, and then the poems also bring in other poets too in the book. We get mentions of Etheridge Knight, right? Morgan Parker, Yona Harvey. There's a lot here. So I'm wondering, to start, could you talk about who you see yourself in conversation with on the page? Who are those writers that you find yourself always drawn to?
There's so many. I think of, from a pure artistic sense, Mos Def, Missy Elliott. Again, the way they elevate play, and even Andre 3000, like they elevate play. And I was talking recently about, or thinking through the idea of a departure album. So Questlove he teaches a class, I believe, might be at NYU, on departure albums. So think like you have Lil Wayne, and then you have the Rebirth album, I think it was, where it's like it's rock music. Like he's a hip hop artist and he's doing rock music, and it's like, that was so cool to me, and it's so cool to me, like the Andre 3000, the Blue Sun. So I'm drawn to artists that are making it more possible for the artists alongside them to have freedom in the work. Um, More artists that are, I guess, of the writing variety would be Lucille Clifton, Michael S. Harper. He writes a lot about American jazz. He has a book pretty much using John Coltrane as a muse for a lot of the work. Wanda Coleman, she has like a series, of course, American Sonnets, which is like, just lovely work, and also kind of an explosion of what we perceive sonnets to be. Terrace Hayes and like lots of others, Diane Seuss, lots of others right now are working in that form. But yeah, like just exploding what the expectation is. And I think that's a really solid place to start. And even if I'm not so much reteaching learning, or the ways we kind of attach to certain inclinations, I appreciate the part of the conversation where it's, where it's office hours and I'm just in their offices gleaning from the information that they have to share. So often, even for me, like I made a note to my editors and had a conversation about this with some of my readers of the manuscript before it was published, about the idea of being in a conversation with and using lyrics from those poems or those songs. Because, within conversation, I don't want to make it seem like these poems, again, are finished products. So if I might reference Etheridge Knight, who's referencing Gwendolyn Brooks also, and it's like it's a lineage that's happening on the page. What might also be interesting is like, how far can I maybe detach from what was said before, and in doing so, am I really that far removed from where they start, like where they are finding themselves in those poems? So yeah, I mean, I think like the idea of being in conversation with other artists is so interesting. My wife and I, we went to an exhibit in Nashville recently, and it's art exhibit, visual art. Latoya Hobbs is doing incredible work on printmaking, and particularly visual art that is carving wood. And the amount of detail in just an image, it makes you think about like pixelation and like, we all see it like, okay, are you a robot? Like, click the things that are right in these boxes, and like the idea of like being able to parse, like we all might see the same thing, but are we going about it with the same humanity? That's kind of where I'm at.
Great. No, that's wonderful. I love, thinking about those conversations and who's in your lineage, right? And who's in their lineage, and how do we sort of find ourselves in those conversations as poets, also recognizing that the people after us will in some way be in conversation with us too.
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting. So a sort of extension of that question about community, how does community factor into your writing process? Community in the broad sense, but maybe even a sense of writing community, those people that you turn to for advice or for early review and things like that.
What's interesting, so I have 2 chapbooks in this book, and with both chapbooks, I so often thought about poetry in that time when I'm kind of like fresh out of college and I didn't have an established writing community around me. As the work was the legs, like it was finding community on my behalf. And you also have obviously like the veracity and the true, like we all went through COVID together. So I'm based in Atlanta, and I'm putting together this collection, which was like 4 or 5 years. I still didn't really have like an established community, but I did have community that was getting built on online presence. So I'm actually a big proponent of like allowing your work to find that community and to be the clear eyes of where you can find a community at. If you're lacking in any way that community. Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about even like Jean Valentine. She mentions in an interview, like they're like, hey, like so like how are you working with other artists? Like other people that you admire, and she's like, hey, like I mean, I would love to work with them, but there's also reality that like some folks get their energy from like in their own silo. And I think it's important to be honest about that because I'm not a person that maybe gathers energy from being around folks. That said, though, my work may take on a different personality than I do. So in the same way that you can respect someone's opinions without putting them down, like I can respect my poems being maybe a bit more extroverted or out there to have those conversations that where I might like be a bit more timid. So yeah.
Yeah, so in terms of sort of letting the poems kind of find that community, was that primarily through like publishing in literary journals or, building a social media presence? How did you sort of navigate that online space?
Yeah, I had no social media presence. So I think for me, I'll call back to I was in spoken word. So at Vanderbilt, I still keep in contact with and made a point to where I did have community be very, very strategic and particular about kindling that fire always. So I'd serve as like a mentor to folks that were still carrying on the club at the campus even after I left, or like making sure they had everything they needed to explore and bring new poets to campus. I also did publish. I tried publishing where I could, and just finding journals that excited me about the work of poetry, because I needed that, and I still do. I don't publish nearly as often as I used to, particularly because I just, your life takes a different shape. So I'm not so much like with that. But I encourage everyone to like, if you are going about maybe like a self-publishing route, like there's nothing wrong with that. Like there's nothing wrong with sending out poems. There's nothing wrong with keeping poems to yourself, but make sure you're being edified or, being fed in some way. And even if it's not submitting poems, you can get a lot of the same function out of reading. So throughout this entire time, I was always reading new work, whether that be like Lillian Yvonne Bertram, Louise Glick. I don't know, like just everyone and everywhere. I could find poems that excited me again. That's where I took residence.
No, that's great. I think it's a great reminder too that everyone will have a different process, right? Not everyone will necessarily be nurtured by, workshops and that type of community. Sometimes, your bookshelf is your community and you can be nurtured in that sense too. Just as important to feed those sides of you and protect your creative energy as well.
And I also add that like probably besides that Mercy book with Lucille Clifton, the first at Vanderbilt Spoken Word, we made a point to connect with organizations in the community. So we did, and I think the school still does work with Southern Word, which is a nonprofit organization that works with high schoolers and middle schoolers about the spoken word, the craft, free expression through written word or aloud. So I think also like just putting yourself in spaces where you can see that work being done in someone else can be particularly a driving point. Yeah. because if it was watching it on Netflix or watching it on YouTube or seeing it in person, like just seeing um, someone want so badly to be understood is definitely something I understand. So yeah, I'm for that in any facet you can get it.
Great. All right. So I'm going to hit you with our last question since we're sadly coming upon our hour. I can't believe it's been that long. Um, but thank you so much for the time you've had today. So our last question is, what's a piece of craft advice that you kind of fall back on or that you would give to a poet who's sort of navigating finding their own voice on the page?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, like you've probably already heard as I've been speaking for this hour, so I definitely don't separate sonics. So whatever you write, even if you don't ever really fully intend to say it out loud, try saying it out loud. I would also say movement for me is a big thing, particularly going about the business. For me, I like walking and I like walking the same route. And why that is because I would hope that upon each return, I am seeing something new. It challenges your eyes, it challenges your heart, your spirit, to like be refreshed by the mundane. Um, do I ever make drawings? I just saw your question, Mona. I'm not good at drawing. Um, yeah, but I do like I guess I used to do like sketching, which is probably a result of like the architectural engineering thing. Didn't really work out for me that much, but um, yeah, not my vibe. But I do encourage however you can get kind of art into the bones, do it.
I love that. Wow. Thank you, Olatunde, for your time this evening and your generosity with us. I feel so sort of overwhelmed by the beauty and the discussion. And just a reminder to everyone, please pick up a copy of Tender-Headed wherever you can get it. Beg your libraries to order it. You will not regret it. It is such an amazing collection. And thank you all for joining us this evening.